And it looks like we're now recording. So welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee. I'm TJ Poor, co-chair, along with Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux. We have quite an agenda today, so I'm going to pull that up really quickly and go over it. Hopefully everybody can see this now. After approving the agenda, we'll go through and see if anybody has any questions about the governance training. Matt Chapman from the council from the Agency of Natural Resources is here, has joined us to answer any questions. We'll approve the minutes from the last two meetings, talk briefly about any co-chair meetings, update, discuss the subcommittee scope. I will have a presentation on the comprehensive energy plan and the relationship between the climate action plan. And that presentation will include modeling expectations, and hopefully that'll be useful context for the next agenda item, the responses to the request for input. We'll talk about the next meeting, public comment, and adjourn. Does anybody have any objections or additions to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, I like to move on to the next agenda item, which is the governance training questions. Matt Chapman is here. He's on the bottom right-hand corner of my screen, and although others may have him in a different spot. I think Jane Lazarchuk sent out the governance training materials last week, either right before or after last week's meeting. And folks have had a chance to review. Hopefully, will they, anybody have any questions for Mr. Chapman? Richard.
Yeah, good afternoon. In the interest of transparency, I would like the members of the subcommittee to know that I have a conflict of interest with one of the likely applicants, one of the responders to the RFI, who is likely to respond to the RFP. And so I will be removing myself from the meeting whenever discussions about the RFP or about choosing among the applicants is ongoing.
Great, thank you, Richard.
It might make sense to have Matt actually address that in a little bit more detail in terms of exactly when it makes sense for you to remove yourself from the meeting, Richard.
Sure. Well, I think we can do that one-on-one unless I can do that one-on-one with Matt, unless you think it's worth the council's time.
Well, I know that both Leslie Ann and Jay Schaefer also participated in submitting information in response to the RFI, so I think it would be probably important to talk about it broadly. Thank you, though.
So I'm happy to just talk about so the sort of governance components that are associated with sort of what we're talking about today are the Open Meetings Law, the Public Records Act, and the State Code of Ethics. And the State Code of Ethics is really where the conflicts of interest provision comes into play. It basically prohibits members of the board from participating on decisions where they have either a personal or a family member having a financial interest in the outcome of that decision. And so basically, if either you or a member of your family, and the State Code of Ethics also defines a family member basically as sort of your immediate family and what lawyers call one sort of the next ring around you. So grandparents, parents, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, stepbrother, and it's defined in the Code of Ethics. So in those particular situations where there is deliberation on a contract or a matter where a financial interest may occur, I think it's appropriate for folks who might have an interest to recuse themselves from those deliberations. And Julie, I don't know that there's much more to say. I mean, it's sort of you should recuse yourself from any decision making that might affect the outcome of this subcommittee's ultimate choice of who obtains or doesn't obtain a grant.
Yeah, and I guess the point of clarity, Matt, is that that it doesn't prevent discussion of sort of the technical substance. It's once we actually receive the RFPs back, as opposed to the framing of the RFP.
I mean, I guess I would just sort of caution folks that if you're going to if you fall within the conflicts, and certainly if you're going to personally be bidding on a proposal, we normally try to make sure that people separate themselves from the formulation of an RFP, in addition to the decision as to who gets selected. And again, I think like internally within the agency, sort of when we give guidance to sub-grantees, the guidance is anything that might create from anyone who's bidding the appearance of some sort of conflict or finger on the scale of the outcome of the decision making should be avoided. And I think it's more of obviously it's more of an appearance than an actual conflict issue, right? I think everyone is responsible and can do their level best to not, but it does create an appearance by others who might be external and participating that there's a conflict that exists. I mean, so with that, I just would put out there. So I did not prepare a sort of presentation or so forth on any of those three elements. And I just would open it up to folks if you have questions or areas you'd like to dive in deeper with respect to open meetings, public records, or the code of ethics. I'm happy to answer those questions either now or frankly taking it offline and having a conversation about it there.
Matt, thank you for the overview, and I'll just ask one because it came up today where a subcommittee member emailed around some information and some guidance, and I, from my recollection of when you gave the presentation to the full Climate Council, that is totally fine to email this document out for discussion at the future meeting, as long as there's no reply all and no not a quorum of members actually talking about the substance. Is that correct?
I do. I think it's perfectly fine for members to share reports, data, sort of topical information for people to review. And then the deliberations and conversations take place at the next meeting. And I think the only sort of corollary in making sure that those materials get to Jane or TJ, you or Leslie Ann, so that they're posted so that the public has access to them as well. But I think that's all consistent with the open meetings law.
Great.
Matt, can I ask a quick question? Actually, you just raised something for me around the ultimate posting of the documents. That's consistent when we're working through documents as a subcommittee that happens. But what about as subcommittees start to share like relevant information, or like one subcommittee in particular wants to create a culture of like shared knowledge. So they're starting to share like webinars or information that might pertain to the work of that subcommittee. Do those things have to ultimately get posted?
I mean, I think the answer is yes, right? I mean, I think to the extent that there is basically knowledge that's forming the basis of sort of the deliberations that are taking place by the subcommittee. They should probably get posted, even if there's sort of a footnote on the agenda or however you want to do it, just ensuring that the public has access to the same information, I think is advisable, right?
Okay, thanks for that.
One
you.
thing, Matt.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, Matt, that I found really helpful when you briefed the council back in November were all of the various ways in which all of the things that may seem innocuous but actually become public record, I think might be helpful and useful for you to just reshare that, because it was in the sort of verbal oral part that may not have been necessarily captured in the written documents when in the presentation. So for example, if you scribble a note on a on a post-it note and it's a thought that then becomes something that's critical to the committee or the council's working, then that becomes a public record. And so little things like that that, you know, I wasn't aware of, that, you know, other folks may not be aware of as well. So if you wanted to share some of those.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, I normally frame it as being anything that you do, any record you create, broadly construed, right? Like whether it be paper, voicemail, digitally, or otherwise, that relates to your business as a of the subcommittee. Whether it's done sort of sort of regardless of when, regardless of how, if it relates to its business, that is a public record. So should the state get it in, so handwritten notes, track changed comments in in a document, postings in Teams or in other sort of venues that are out there, all of those are public records and subject to the Vermont Public Records Act. So folks should just appreciate that if there's ever a records request associated with that, all of that information needs to be produced. I think the other thing that's probably just worth noting as well is that is the case whether it takes place in a government account or whether it takes place in your personal accounts, right? So if you're talking with another member of the committee about committee-related business using your personal email, that's a public record. And so I don't know whether we've extended official accounts to all subcommittee members as well. Shane?
Yes, I'm patiently waiting for that final note to say that they're all up and running, but I haven't gotten it.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess I would strongly encourage subcommittee members that you use your Vermont.gov account. The challenge, of course, is if there's a Public Records Act and you've been using your personal one, people like me are going to have to come to you and ask you to access your personal accounts and provide emails. And frankly, I prefer not doing that. I prefer that we keep things in the government accounts. So.
Thanks for that, Matt, because that was eye-opening for me, and I think it's always good to hear that and be conscious and aware of that. I think Richard has a question or has his hand up.
I think that might have been in a previous hand there.
I took it down.
Okay. So any other questions for Matt today? Okay.
So I guess I would just, before I go, I guess I would say if questions come up sort of through the course of your business, or you have questions or concerns about any of these issues, how we're handling legal services is you should coordinate with TJ and Leslie Ann, but also with Jane. And Jane will reach out to me, and either I will help and respond to those issues, or we'll have an attorney from A&R assigned to help. So great. Good luck in your work. I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Matt, for your time.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so moving on and continuing my role as a taskmaster on this big agenda here. approval of the last 2 minutes from our March 5th and our March 10th subcommittee meetings. Those are linked in the agenda and have been posted to the AOA website. I also sent them around to subcommittee members this morning. Does anybody have any comments or edits on the minutes from the last 2 meetings? And does anybody object to approving the minutes? Hearing no objection, we'll consider those minutes approved. Thank you all. And we will remove the draft watermark on those minutes on the website.
Thanks again for those who took the minutes.
Yeah, they were done.
Good job.
Yeah, very much appreciate that for all. So the staff have been rotating. I've been asking staff to the agency staff that's been assigned to the subcommittee to take minutes. Today, Andrea Wright was up and was volunteered, although she claimed she was going to volunteer anyway, and I believe her. So thank you, Andrea, in advance.
Minutes reflect TJ's belief that you would have done that otherwise.
And that's why his camera is off too.
Is my camera off? It's intended to be on.
No, I can see you.
Okay.
Brian shaking his head. You can't see TJ either, can you?
No, I can't see him either.
Okay, well, it's not just me.
Yeah,
I think that is a funny Teams thing. Like a bunch of people show as not being visible to me, and then if you ever look at the YouTube video, they show in the YouTube video after the fact. So it must be the bandwidth issue.
There's a word for that. But anyway, go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, that's strange. I'm sorry you can't see me, but maybe that's a good thing. So next on the agenda is co-chairs meetings up to date. I have a brief update from the meeting of the co-chairs of this subcommittee and the cross-sector subcommittee. Before I dive into that, I'm going to ask if Leslie Ann, if you've had any more communication with Sue Minter and the Just Transitions Committee, and you have an update there.
So I actually have an update from so it's Just Transitions, Rural Resilience, possibly our Ag and Forest Lands. We were going back and forth last night in terms of trying to come to terms with the timing. And so the 4 co-chairs emailed back and forth, and I was hoping to have some materials from Abby Course to share. Not sure she was able to get those to me in time, but we have been thinking about ways of collaborating across those 4 subcommittees, and also thinking about the ways in which the workload is evolving and what it means for our subcommittee members, because there are particular concerns in the Ag subcommittee in terms of how it's shaking out for their subcommittee members. So once I have more concrete pieces on that, I'll be able to share that with you.
Great. Thank you, Leslie Ann. And from the meeting we just had right before this one, between the co-chairs of this committee and the cross-sector committee, and I'll also note that Councilmember Duval, Jared, was there, as well as we had talked about previously, being a liaison, being on both committees, to be a liaison between the committees. And first, we welcomed Catherine Morris from CBI, who's going to potentially, well, not potentially, will have some time available to help us with facilitation at the subcommittee level. And she won't necessarily be joining every meeting, but when needed, and can also help us think about agendas, tools for making decision processes, and particularly when it comes time to decision making, to be able to potentially facilitate those areas, and particularly when there may not be consensus right up front. And so welcome to Catherine. I'm not sure if she's able to join today, but
I'm here, TJ. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm not able to stay for the whole session, but I am using this as kind of a way to orient myself to the work that you're doing and where you are. So thanks very much.
Yep. Great. Thank you. And then we had quite a long discussion where we didn't finalize it, but we discussed the comprehensive energy plan and the climate action plan overlap. I won't go too far into this now because I'll be presenting on the comprehensive energy plan, which will give a whole lot more context. But really the discussion centered around the overlap and the implications on the timeline as it relates to the RFI discussion we're going to have shortly, the CEP modeling, that's CEP is short for Comprehensive Energy Plan, and the Climate Action Plan. And really considering the overlap in the two processes and trying to drive to a recommendation of what we're going to do, what we're going to recommend to address it. We have a lot of some more work. We had some more discussion on how the committees might interact, the science and data being in service in part to the cross-sector committee is providing recommendations and iterating with that cross-sector committee. So we've talked a lot about all of that in our committee, and I guess I'm going to open it to Jared if you wanted to add anything, or Jane. I'm trying not to go too far, but if I left out anything critical, please, jump in.
Yeah, I'd say we didn't kind of fully, come to an end point on this discussion, but we raised the really important point of just the coordination of roles and just trying to get greater clarity on this RFI review process, and then building towards an RFP and kind of what role this committee would have in service of and vis-a-vis the cross-sector mitigation committee. I'd also just note, I mean, this is at the risk of stating the obvious, but for science and data committee members who are interested and available, or anyone who is on this meeting, member of the committee, member of the public, whoever, the cross-sector mitigation committee meetings are happening a little bit less frequently. We're meeting weekly at this point. They are meeting bi-weekly. And so their first meeting within the last couple of weeks is going to happen tomorrow from 11 to 2. And, just a reminder that link and agenda is up on the council website at the Agency of Administration, but it may be one, I think particularly some of these earlier ones, if folks are, definitely a number of us will be on both. I think Jane and myself as the liaison between the committees and Catherine, I assume, but if additional people are available, I think the more of us who are kind of aware of the work in the different committees and how we can help kind of connect and align that, the better. But of course, no pressure, because this is already a big time and work commitment.
Yeah, thanks to you both. I don't have anything to add right now. I'm sure we'll get into more of it as we go through the agenda.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to be on that. I had advising students. It's registration time.
Okay, thank you. So hearing no other questions on those updates, we'll move on to our subcommittee scope. We've talked about this quite a bit, and we need to wrap this up in order to have it submitted to the full council. I'm going to pull up the scope again on my screen. Bear with me. So can folks see the screen?
Can you make it bigger? That's better.
Okay. So Member Hopkins, you submitted the two small edits here, I think with the same purpose, and I'll let you describe that if you're willing.
Sure. As some of you know, my claim to recent fame is that a group, the organization that I work with, the Climate Economy Action Center of Addison County, prepared a greenhouse gas inventory for Addison County. And in the course of doing that, we identified quite a few places where there are existing statewide data, but it's hard to come by sub-state data, regional data. And I thought it would be important in the long run, as long as we're identifying gaps, to identify gaps both in our data for the statewide analysis, but also identify gaps for any regional analyses that might follow using the same methods. So that's why I proposed these two edits have the same effect. They're just in two different places in the text. I hasten to add that I'm not proposing that the product that we're going to come up with at the end would have regional analyses in it. I'm simply proposing that as we identify gaps, that we note them.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go for it.
I struggled with this a little bit, Richard, and I think it's just trying to figure out what the what our role is as the state of Vermont in addressing some of these regional data needs. And I guess maybe it's as much a question back to you as anything, which is the intent of having the look be both at the state and regional level, just that we sort of would then be informed by what we can and can't control to the extent it's a state level data need. Obviously, that's within our purview. To the extent it's a regional data need, is it the intention then that we would potentially adjust or adapt our approach as a result of recognizing that this isn't the data we want, but it's the data we have?
So as before, we have these two parallel processes kind of yoked together loosely: the comprehensive energy plan, right, and the climate plan that we're going to develop here. At the regional level, the comprehensive energy plan has generated targets and work at the regional level, where each planning region has been allocated a portion of the statewide goal to meet. And this was pushed down to the regional level 3 or 4 years ago, and yet there are significant data gaps in the way of regional planning commissions being able to actually do that push down work in a scientifically credible way.
I misunderstood what you meant by regional. I was assuming like New England as opposed to RPC.
Addison County,
yeah,
or
yeah.
County.
Yeah, I think we need a clarifying
reaction.
word or two there.
Yeah, I had the same reaction, Julie. When I hear regional, I think all of the Northeast.
Correct.
And
yeah.
so
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about that. I would be happy if somebody wants to make that. So if you want to say sub-state analyses, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, or county level. I mean, whatever you think the right planning unit is, but I absolutely went bigger than Vermont as opposed to a smaller than Vermont, the whole of Vermont.
Okay, the same change down below, right? That's fine.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, that's really helpful comment on that, because being involved with the energy plan, I immediately knew what Richard was talking about in regional planning commission and in potentially municipalities, and wouldn't have gone there myself. So, and recognize the need that there are gaps in data, and that it'll be helpful for this committee to elevate those. So with this change, I'd like to pose to the subcommittee members that we adopt this scope of work. These two changes, I suppose, are the only changes from the version that we had last time around. And
just a clarifying question, TJ, do you mean this committee charge? Previously, we talked about separating the charge from the the scope of work, or are you talking about the charge and the scope of work together being approved?
Thank you for that clarification, Jared. It's the charge, so everything from this number 4 up.
Okay.
And I in my mind, I was calling that the scope of work, with what's happening below to be the work plan.
Oh, okay.
But that probably wasn't obvious what was in my mind to everybody else. So,
I think because we haven't talked about the milestones really, we spent most of the time doing a lot of wordsmithing and making sure the content was in place for 4 and above. So.
Right. So with that clarification, number 4 here and above, so the first page and the first paragraph plus of the second page here, are there any objections to adopting this as the subcommittee charge? So hearing none, we'll accept these changes and then put that forth to the Climate Council Steering Committee and full council on Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, so next on the agenda is the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And I'll apologize in advance for having gone rather quickly through those other items. There's just a lot on the agenda, and I was trying to move at pace through there so that we could get to this discussion and the RFI discussion in the next hour here. So thank you for bearing with me there. I'm going to share a presentation that was sent out. This is opening much differently than. Okay, can folks see the screen? There should be a title slide.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Bear with me. My screens are doing something strange here. So. Okay, so yeah, I'm transitioning from facilitator role to presenting role. On the Comprehensive Energy Plan summary. So we're going to talk about the responses to the RFI in a moment, but it felt appropriate to share with the committee a bit about what's been happening with the department and what is the Department of Public Services responsibility for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. The Global Warming Solutions Act did not remove the responsibility of the department to complete the plan. You'll likely see and hear a version of this presentation if you come to the full council meeting on Monday as well. So I'll run through several slides as quickly as I can so we can leave some time for discussion. But really my objectives for today are to orient the committee to the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which I'll probably refer to as the CEP throughout. So if you hear me say CEP, that's what I mean. And what it represents. We'll discuss the relationship of the CEP to the Climate Action Plan, and then review timelines, both the entire Comprehensive Energy Plan and then the timeline and the process for the modeling, which is already underway. So first, the plan, and really all the Department of Public Service does as the state energy office and the ratepayer advocate is in service to Vermont's energy policy. So portions of energy policy are littered throughout statute, but the most direct location is in Title 30, 202A. And adequacy, reliability, security, affordability, economic vitality, efficiency, cost effectiveness, and of course, greenhouse gas reductions are all tenets of our energy policy. And as you all know, those don't all always flow in the same direction. They sometimes rub against one another. And the goal of energy policy is to rationalize those differences and those kind of sometimes competing directions and put forth a coherent policy going forward. So the energy plan in service of these objectives, we have a specific section of statute, Title 30, 202B, that requires the development of an energy plan every 6 years. It's a comprehensive analysis across energy sectors, so it's both sources and demand, sources of and demand for energy, with projections up to at least 20 years out. The department also has responsibility for an electric plan, reliability of the electric grid, and optimization of the system, which is critically important given the amount of electrification that's expected to be necessary in the future. Least cost planning is a term that we often use in the electric sector, and the department really applies that not only in the electric sector, but across all sectors. We last published the document in January 2016. It had over 300 recommendations, but at the top level, it maintained the vision for 90% renewable energy across all sectors of the energy economy by 2050. Then the plan structure was divided into sectoral chapters with detailed information on various renewables, incorporation of the state energy plan. It had undercurrents of energy efficiency and health throughout the plan, as well as land use and siting. We're required to complete a new plan by January of 2022. So Climate Action Plan, December 2021, Comprehensive Energy Plan, January 2022. And within that plan, it needs to include standards and recommendations for regional and municipal energy planning pursuant to Act 174. I think everybody may know this already, but the plan has to be consistent with greenhouse gas requirements, Climate Action Plan, and land use goals of the state. So the CEP and the Climate Action Plan, which listed throughout this presentation sometimes as CAP, are overlapping but distinct planning requirements. They're two different reports with two different goals. One doesn't obviate the need for the other, but they'll need to interact and inform one another. And the slide on your screen here compares the CEP and the CAP at a really high level. Energy policy behind the CEP is already covered, but at the risk of oversimplification, the Climate Action Plan's core intent is greenhouse gas mitigation and climate adaptation. There's many other issues that are tackled by the council, and I don't want to minimize those, but I don't want to get into it too deeply right now. But I do want to be clear that the energy plan is not a climate change plan. So it's consistent with and a key component of meeting the state's greenhouse gas requirements. And it'll reflect some planning for impacts of climate change on the energy system. It's a comprehensive look at Vermont's, it is not a comprehensive look at Vermont's non-energy related greenhouse gas emissions or climate adaptation needs. Two more things worth noting on this slide is that, or about this slide, I suppose, the energy plan statute was changed a little bit by the GWSA in order to require consistency with the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Climate Action Plan. But at the same time, the Climate Action Plan is to be informed by the energy plan. So there, you can see there's this symbiotic relationship between the two plans. And finally, the CEPs every 6 years, the Climate Action Plan every 4 years. These plans are going to recur only once every 12 years. I made this joke before, but Jane will probably be here for that, but I don't know about the rest of us. So this next slide is just an attempt to dig another layer deeper into the areas of overlap and distinction between the two plans. And I'll just focus really on the major areas of overlap. Greenhouse gas reduction requirements. I'm sorry. It says targets here. That really should say requirements. Are the most obvious overlap, but in developing the plans, both will need to rely on energy sector analysis, including policy and technology scenarios and or pathways. Both have overlapping public engagement efforts, and both are deeply concerned with equity. And I'll just mention a couple of things that the Climate Action Plan is responsible for that the Energy Plan really doesn't include. And I mentioned climate adaptation and non-energy greenhouse gas emissions, like those are like agriculture and waste, but also sequestration. And there's a real focus on the climate inventory and in the Climate Action Plan that isn't present in the Energy Plan charge. Quickly, just noting that we have starting points of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions requirements and our previous 90% by 2050 target. Those are really our starting points, and we're starting to model and think about those. But as we move through the process, moving from those, whether it turns into something different and more stringent, or if 90% renewable is not a priority, we are very open for discussion on all points. Timeline. So the schedule from get from here to there on development. We actually started a few months ago by requesting a request for information on a number of key questions related to policy and technology scenarios that inform our modeling framework, where our staff is busy now sorting through a bunch of those comments and pulling out key themes and issues that we should address. Dozens of comments that we received on that. And then also in partnership with the Air Quality Control Division of the Department of Environmental Conservation inside of the Agency of Natural Resources, we've engaged NESCOM, who is a regional assembly of air emissions regulators, and the Stockholm Energy Institute to conduct modeling for the energy plan and greenhouse gas pathways analysis. So I'll talk about those a bit more in a minute, but sticking on this slide, we have stakeholder engagement over this next several months, and that includes both key selected stakeholders, which we view the Climate Council and this subcommittee as key stakeholders, and also broader engagement in service of the draft energy plan in September and a final in January. So the modeling, and I think this is where it really starts to get relevant for the RFI discussion. So thank you for bearing with me on the background, but I thought it was important to share all that. So as I noted, we engaged with NESCOM and Stockholm Energy Institute to assist us with our modeling effort. SEI, that's Stockholm Energy Institute, has developed the Low Emissions Analysis Platform, or LEAP, which is an integrated scenario-based modeling tool that can be used to track and estimate energy consumption and production. And that's across all sectors of an economy. It can account for both energy sector and non-energy sector greenhouse gas emissions, sources and sinks. It can also be used to analyze emissions of local and regional air pollutants and short-lived climate pollutants. And those often go to climate co-benefits. Not on the slide, but I should mention that the model also reports energy costs, so estimating the cost of serving our energy needs under both a business as usual and other policy technology scenarios. And it can be regionalized. Going to the discussion we just had, In fact, LEAP was used 5 years ago as the basis for helping municipalities and regional planning commissions project impacts of or what is going to happen in their towns and how they can plan to change that. Really importantly for us, this is a what I'll just refer to as an open model. It's the model that the model will be provided to the state along for training for state agencies to continue to have access and conduct more scenario analysis on our own, and also to track progress toward requirements. So I was involved in the total energy study that preceded the last comprehensive energy plan, which was a really similar modeling effort. And we chose a model that was really excellent. It was called the Times-Markel model. And we had a firm that did an excellent job, Dunsky Energy Consulting out of Montreal. The model had, I think, maybe a few more bells and whistles, but just a few. But ultimately, it was kind of a black box that we couldn't use after the study. And so we really had trouble kind of squaring that total energy study modeling and then kind of continuing that going forward. So I want to underscore the fact that we're going to have this model as well as trained up to have expertise to run the model was a really attractive feature of the model. And lastly, I think the modeling timeline. We all know that the action plan timeline for December is really tight. The energy plan timeline isn't much better, being due in January, but we do have the advantage of already engaging the consultant. Stockholm Energy, let me back up. As I mentioned, we issued the RFI in December. This was a separate request for input, not the RFI we're about to talk about, but one that the department issued for the policy and technology pathways questions and recommendations for what we should model, what we should consider as we model. We got those responses, and now we're in the midst of developing a business as usual case, which should be ready by the end of the month for all sectors except the power sector. But we can make some simplifying assumptions to understand, the impact of, electrification on a business as usual context in terms of emissions from the electric sector. The schedule then calls for kind of an iterative process in April on that business as usual draft. This I highlighted where key stakeholder feedback will be sought, and then we'll do the electric sector analysis and begin a single scenario analysis in May. And so this one will just be we know a number of the technologies that are available to us. We'll pick a policy that gets us there, saying we meet our requirements, and how does this shake out? With that, we'll have a draft of the power sector impacts and a draft of the non-energy sector impacts, and get feedback on that. So we have kind of this one trajectory going forward, a business as usual in one scenario, and we can see the delta, the difference in costs, et cetera, and get feedback on that. And really in June and July, it's how do we pull the levers to adjust that based on policy preferences. So a lot of that is kind of the iteration between the, in my mind, could be, I should say, the iteration between the cross-sector committee and this committee. And this is all leading to final scenario modeling. We would choose several more scenarios to model to highlight differences in approaches to be done in August, with any additional outreach after that. And a final formal technical report to be done in September. I have on here post-report. It may be able to happen sooner, but really regionalizing the model and getting to regional planning commissions and potentially municipalities that we're structuring the model up front to try and be able to do that as best as possible with the data that is currently available, and then to actually separate the plan, the modeling into regions. Will perhaps replace with any available regional data that we have, any statewide pro rata data, and see how that works going forward. So that was a lot. I'll note that there's a couple of appendices slides that are just kind of references to the statutes, the energy plan statutes and electric plan statute. But with that, I will finally stop talking and open the floor for questions or comment. And can somebody tell me if I'm still sharing the screen?
You're still sharing on mine anyway.
Okay. Oh, okay. There we go. Stop presenting.
Thanks, TJ. Looks like Jared has his hand up.
Okay, thanks.
TJ, just one quick clarifying question. When you talk about a single scenario being modeled in May, I just want to make sure I understand the use of the term scenario. So is that a scenario in which multiple kind of tools and levers are used to achieve the overall needed emissions reduction? Or is that a scenario modeling one of the technology pathways around how to achieve a certain share of, building retrofits and weatherization or electric vehicle adoption, for instance?
It's more the latter. Without committing to it, I'm hopeful that it can be somewhat of a cost optimization scenario, so that it is this is the least cost way according to the current inputs of the model, but that may be by May being a little too optimistic, but it is going to be a single set of technologies that meet the targets.
Their share of the overall targets, not
right.
Putting, yeah,
right, yeah, as not a single technology, but a grouping of technologies with their own shares. So I guess I don't know how familiar folks are with the work that Jared has done with his EAN pathways model, but I see it as somewhat similar at this stage as that in terms, but it could have some, ideally it would be cost optimized, which would be another layer beyond what the EAN work has, but it is a set of different technologies that could get there. Any other questions or comments on the energy plan, what it is, or the approach?
I think it was really helpful, TJ, to have that sort of comparison and the overlap between the two, and sort of setting the stage with where some of the crosstalk and crosswalk was going, and where what it is not and where it is, and so on, to have it all in one place. So thank you for taking the time and space to do that.
And I just want to second that. That was very helpful for my understanding as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, the two of you, at least, who are on the full council, will get to see a version of that again on Monday.
We'll talk along with you then.
Yeah, great. Jay, it looked like you had your hand up.
Yeah, just real quick, I just want to understand the people who are here and bridging the gap between the CEP and this group. TJ, it seems like you are the primary point person there and sharing that knowledge and making those connections.
Well, from the I guess I'm one of the primary people. When I think about it in the council writ large, I'm leading the modeling work for the Department of Public Service. There's Ed McNamara, who's the director of planning at our office, is also coordinating this overlap, and he's on the cross-sector subcommittee. And then Jane is doing a whole lot of work as the manager of the Global Warming Solutions Act to help that interface.
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, three of us are probably the primary folks.
Thanks.
Lou, it looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. Thanks for walking through that presentation. Yeah, very helpful, as others have said. It occurs to me that maybe this is a question bigger than this subcommittee alone, but given the various energy and technology forecasts that are going on, I think it's great that we have so many different forecasts, because it gives us different ways to look at how decarbonization will work. And from my point of view, especially in terms of its impacts on the electric sector. So it's great to have these different looks at it, but I think that one of the things we should keep in mind while developing our work for the subcommittee is to make sure that we have some way of translating this to be able to compare it to the other forecasts that exist. What are the key indices and what are the major points? And I think, we would probably do that work anyways, but just to make sure that we're making it easy to line this up against another forecast at the end of the day.
Right. So, I know for the, for instance, in the business as usual case, for the energy plan, at least, we're planning on a starting point is the Velco long range transmission plan forecast for, penetration of electric vehicles and heat pumps. And we're not just going to adopt that writ large. We're going to say, okay, you did that mostly last year or, a year plus ago, a lot of the work on that, and say, well, heat pumps look like there's more of them than we anticipated, and adjust. But I take your point, and we'll want to be able to say, well, when somebody's looking at the long range transmission plan of Velco and looking at that forecast, and we have a business as usual that's different, let's explain that difference. And I think it also goes to, and we'll cross over into this RFI discussion in a minute, but really, Lou, your point of really understanding any different modeling that's out there and how modeling can leverage each other is really important. And one of my hopes is that at a minimum, the data going into all of the work for the energy plan and for the climate action plan, at bare minimum, that really needs to be the same data. Otherwise, we're just making a whole lot more work for us on the back end. Richard.
Hi. As you know, I come from a public health background, where our approach, so I grew up in a particular approach to planning, and in the school of thought that I grew up in, we depend very heavily on what we call logic models. That is, explicit models that indicate the pathway between the activity that you're doing and the intended outcome. And there may be 2 or 3 intermediate actions between the sort of low-level thing that you're actually doing and the eventual outcome. That's also a kind of model. It's a logic model rather than a quantitative model. And I just wonder whether that way of thinking is at all familiar to you, and whether it would be helpful to include a logic model component in this planning work. I would be happy to give a more detailed disquisition someday if there's interest, but I've hit the main points there.
So I think of that as, and maybe this is incorrect, but I think of that as kind of a decision tree type analysis. In you know, the actions we have, we take here are going to lead to a number of forks in the road, and we can then choose another action and another action, and we need to look at the end of the day to see if all the forks in the road kind of still get us to the same spot. Is it? And I suppose that decision tree is a type maybe of a logic analysis, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're talking about.
Well, one of the strengths of a logic model is that you identify intermediate outcomes between your activities and your eventual desired outcome, and then you can measure progress in the intermediate outcomes, even if it's too soon to measure progress in your ultimate outcome. That's particularly important in public health, where you may have a 20 or 30-year latent period between an exposure and a cancer, for example, and you don't want to wait 30 years to see whether your activities are being effective. So you find immediate endpoints that you can measure progress towards in a much shorter time frame.
It reminds me of strategic planning, where you do strategic mapping and have your high-level priorities, and then figure out what are the activities that you need to get to those high-level priorities. So it's something similar, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor this point. I just want to point out that there are different ways of thinking about modeling, and that the kind of modeling you're talking about is, of course, it's not the kind I'm most familiar with, but it is, I'm sure, necessary and important for this work.
Right. Jared, oh, your hand went down and then it went back up, actually.
Richard, I just want to thank you for that and offer a thought. Please correct me if you think I'm off on this, but it strikes me that approach of a logic model, I kind of am thinking of our modeling effort in kind of two related but somewhat distinct phases. One is the kind of technology pathways, where it's really straight math in terms of the sources of emissions and the emissions factors that are applied to them. And given the known and proven technologies and the characteristics and measures we have for them, what adds up to actually meeting the emissions reduction? I can see how a logic model could be helpful to me there, but that feels a little bit more straightforward. It feels like where a logic model will be most, or its equivalent in this space, will be most needed is on a different type of modeling, which is kind of the policy scenario analysis, which involves so many assumptions about kind of behavior and how people respond to different regulations or policies or incentives in terms of elasticities of demand and all of those things. In your experience with logic model work in the public health realm, is that more about kind of assessing the response to a designed intervention? Because to me, I see it as we really need that type of thinking on the design of the interventions or the policies, but maybe not as much on the kind of straight kind of emissions calculations and technology pathway work.
So if you had, if your goal was to reduce youth tobacco use, a laudable goal, you might have a series of activities, changes in the legal age at purchase, media campaigns, clubs at school, and so on. And one of the first things you could measure would be changes in attitudes by youth about tobacco smoking. I intend to start smoking. I think a year from now I'll be smoking. So you can assess attitudes and beliefs towards smoking, which are precursors of smoking behavior. Then you can measure youth smoking behavior as a more distal activity. And of course, the ultimate outcome in reduced heart attacks and lung cancer is going to be 20, 30 years down the road. You're not going to measure that in the short run. But that's just an example of a kind of where you identify, well, what should be the earliest thing we can measure if we do this right, if our intervention is working. I don't know yet enough about modeling in this space to even be able to give examples from the energy field, because it's much easier for me to give them from the public health field. And I think that they probably make sense to you all as just regular.
Thanks, Jane. You had your hand up, and then I recognize that we're starting to run short of time, and we get to talk about the RFIs.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I was going to help transition us anyway. I think that this presentation, while it may become, you may see it multiple times over the course of the next week. It's really important because I think it's important to recognize that there's these two parallel paths and they're going to touch along the way, and that can be accidental or it can be coordinated. And I think in our best interest, we'll do it as coordinated as we can at the right points along the way. And with respect to the role of, that overlap slide that TJ showed spoke to the role of the science and the modeling that will inform the CEP and could ultimately also inform the climate action plan. There are other points along the process like public engagement, equity. There's a lot of stuff for us as a council and effort to think about how we coordinate. But with respect to this specific role of this committee, I think it was a really timely presentation to sort of tee up the conversation around your review and sustenance of the RFI proposals. And just to reiterate, to be thinking about both the modeling that TJ just spoke to, as well as other ideas that are out there and other analyses as we start to suss through the RFI proposals and what they mean for ultimately getting contractual services on board for the technical analyses needed for the climate action plan. So I just wanted to suggest that there's a lot there with the comprehensive energy plan, and I think it's both great that we're having these conversations and also not out of character for agencies to coordinate on these planning efforts, and it's just good government. So we'll keep doing that at a larger scale, and I'd love to advance the conversation around the RFIs, knowing that we don't have much time left, and that could be a really rich conversation for this group.
Thank you, Jane. Jared, was your hand a new one or an old one? Okay.
Old, sorry, take it down.
So then the next item on the agenda is the RFI response, and ideally we would have had that comprehensive energy plan presentation last week in advance of review of the RFIs, so you could have a little bit of context and what's already planned for the state for that effort as you think about what could an independent third party do for us, and how should we shape a request for proposals based on the RFI. So I'm not really sure at this point how to structure this in the 10 or 15 minutes that we have available for the conversation, because I think we could talk about it for an hour and a half or longer.
I guess if I may, I might just tee it up. I want to provide, and I think you should provide space for, general thoughts upon the review of the RFI, but I want to also recognize like somewhat of the urgency to think about how we advance the RFIs to an RFP or multiple RFPs. And I just want to say that and think about the role of this committee that was reaffirmed, my thinking of it, with also when we met with cross sector, in that I really see this committee as sort of providing the meat behind what would be a recommendation to the steering committee and ultimately the council on how we're going to pursue technical expertise that we need to complete the climate action plan. And while that could be informed by the work of the other subcommittees, I think the analyses and understanding of what came in the RFI really resides with this group. And so I sort of want to take your pulse on feeling like, have we had enough time with the RFIs, but then also continue to say that without moving to an RFP, the longer we take on that, the longer it is till we have these services on contract, knowing that the comprehensive energy plan, for instance, already started that back in December, and we're actually due a month ahead of them. So with our plan, so I just want to underscore the importance of this committee and your buy-in and recommendation of ultimately how we advance an RFP, but then also appreciate your thoughts and feedback more broadly on the questions we asked in the RFI, and then what ultimately we should think about with scope of work. Jared, I see your hand went up, which is great.
Thanks, Jane. I just wanted to ask if you could set any additional context that you may want to on, in terms of, I feel like you have a really good sense, given your seat and position in connecting all of these dots, on the overall kind of timeline. And when you speak about the kind of urgency of being able to move from an RFI to an RFP, do you have a proposed timeline in your head for kind of what we'd be working backwards from, in terms of, you know, when an RFP is kind of drafted and sent out, that we could then kind of, in terms of organizing, you know, review and input process?
Yeah, hopefully I get this right, but the timeline around the RFP was that the hope would be that we would move quickly into drafting an RFP next week, right after the Climate Council meets, or RFPs. And whether we get there or not, I'm not 100%, but because I would love to bring the RFP to this group before it actually gets posted. So that would mean either having it ready for next Wednesday, and we haven't started it yet, but perhaps that's conceivable. And then knowing that whenever the RFP is drafted, whether it's after next Wednesday, so by Friday next week, or the following Friday, if we need an extra week, that it'll be posted for 2 weeks. And then there'll be a review in-house for a week of a team, which I would imagine would either include this whole subcommittee or a subset of this subcommittee, as it did with the outreach engagement RFP with Just Transitions. You guys would have an active role in reviewing and ranking the RFP, and then we would make a selection, and that would still take another week to 2 weeks to actually have that person on contract. So when someone at our last meeting, at the co-chair meeting, suggested mid-April, I think like best the end of April, we have the technical service contracts in place. And so then your TJ and all of you can speak much better to what that means for actually having products to work with on timelines.
Well, I wonder if there's a process here where we could all provide our comments into one format. Jane, you sent around a Excel spreadsheet. I don't know where that's at. And then if the Climate Council could give us the authority to kind of further shape the RFP in our next meeting, in order to give us some time, because it's unrealistic for us to think in 10 minutes we're going to actually talk about this. And so if the Climate Council is willing to give us that authority, then we could have next week's agenda devoted just to this, and we could then there's another development of the RFP, and the following week we kind of respond to that, and then it gets issued. Is that a realistic scenario?
That makes a lot of sense to me, and seems like a reasonable timeline now that you've both had the presentation of the comprehensive energy plan, a week with the RFIs, and maybe we think a little bit about right now then, like the Excel spreadsheet I shared was simply naming the proposals. I'd love to use this time with you all to refine what we would like to see your analysis and comments look like in that Excel spreadsheet, and perhaps I rework that, share that with you all pretty quickly, and then know that I can summarize it up and present it to you all for next week's meeting to then lead to the drafting of the RFP. And I think that would work well, because then we would have a substantive meeting the following Wednesday about the RFP or RFPs as well. And the next day would be a steering committee meeting, I think, based on my mind. So that they would give the authority to the Science and Data Subcommittee to put it all together, and then could bless it on behalf of the full council at the steering committee the next day, and it could be posted that Friday.
Do you have actual dates that you're looking at as you say these things, Jane,
Yes.
so I can visualize or?
Yep.
The first one being the deadline for our RFI feedback.
Yeah, the deadline would likely have to be, for me to turn around meaningful synthesis of that, would have to be Monday, the 22nd. And then at your subcommittee meeting on the 24th, we would present your synthesis of the RFIs that I would sum up and present to you all for the final consideration of how we advance an what the components of the RFP would look like. And then at your meeting on the 31st, I would have ahead of your meeting on the 31st shared with you the RFP for you to review, likely by the 27th or 29th, either the Friday the 26th or Monday the 29th. And then there's a steering committee meeting on April 1st where we could make a motion to advance the RFP of the technical services.
So I think the only flag I see in that, Jane, is that we get the RFP back on the 29th, and then we have the subcommittee meeting on the 31st, where we might provide additional feedback on that RFP, and then there's not much turnaround for you on the 1st, but I don't know that there's a way around that.
Okay.
Well, also that's also a week that some folks may need to take off.
I also wonder if folks, if it should just be a subset of the subcommittee that does this review. That's in recognition of all the time commitment that this is, and both the realities of the time frame that we're working under.
Yeah, I appreciate that, TJ, and I thought of that a minute ago and didn't speak to it, but that is how the Just Transitions Committee worked with the RFP for engagement and outreach. The co-chairs both worked on it and then allowed additional members to step up and help with review and ranking of those two. And only 2 of those additional members. So there were 4 total. And of course, even if you didn't do a thorough analysis of the RFIs and ultimately the RFP, there would be a chance to weigh in at your subcommittee meeting.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking along the lines of it would be great for everyone who's on the subcommittee to have the opportunity to review, not necessarily an expectation that everyone would, and depending on different schedules at different
Right. So I just think we need to make sure that we at least have a couple of committed folks that are willing to do it. Jared, looks like you volunteered.
Yeah.
I'm 98% sure that I would be doing it. And so, to the extent that subcommittee members feel that's enough, we could go with there without others being committed, and then, or we could seek anybody else. So, hearing no other, volunteers that want to commit to doing it, I think that's fine. I think it'll be, Jared and I definitely will do it, and then we can synthesize. Jane, you can synthesize that feedback and any other hopefully other folks have had a chance to at least look, and even if it's not in a structured format, could provide even just an email comments. It might be helpful if you have any, but other than that, we can just get the comments at at the next subcommittee meetings.
What about Bennett? I see you're on the call. What about someone from like DC or since you have the contract in partnership with DPS on the comprehensive energy plan, would it be appropriate to lean into someone, and maybe I follow up with Heidi Hales, the director, after this, or if you Bennett would want to help with that, it might make sense since you guys have the expertise within our agency around this.
Yes, I expect we'd pitch in and help guide it.
Thank you.
Right.
So one last point of clarification. The proposals that are going to be reviewed are the ones that you selected, or are they all of them?
Oh, that's a good question. I only flagged those. I flagged those intentionally as a representation of some diversity across the proposals, but I didn't sort of flag them. Yeah, that's a good question, Leslie Ann. I don't like, the ultimate goal is to consider the breadth of what we want to contract with in an RFP. So for me, it's not necessarily I flagged those, and that's one person's opinion on like what was representative. And so I think that you can touch in and touch out at any point, and perhaps it's best if I think about the framework in the spreadsheet of identifying the questions that we're trying to answer in order to advance an RFP and not hyper focusing in on each proposal themselves, then you know what I mean. And maybe Jared, I hate to voluntold you in front of everybody, but maybe you could help me perhaps just as someone who has a hand in both cross sector and science, and just knowing TJ, your time commitment to so many things right now, about just framing what those sequential questions would be for folks looking at the proposals.
Yeah, with you about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Jared. So stay tuned, and I guess I would expect that I would send out a spreadsheet framing those questions by the end of the week, hopefully.
And I guess the reason why I asked is I know that there was some challenges with getting on the SharePoint site, and so not all of the things were shared. And so if folks wanted to have the ability to, even if they can weigh in at a higher level as opposed to like a granular level, to be able to have access to whatever needs to be looked at. I'm seeing Lou sort of shake his head. Is that what you're thinking or hoping for, Lou, or?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to access the SharePoint, but I saw the 5 RFIs that were shared. I think that was from Jane, and that was useful. I think probably reviewing all 15 in detail is not something that everybody will be able to do, but yeah, in so much as it's possible to just take a look through them would be good.
Great. I expect that you'll have state email addresses in the next day or so, which would give you full access to the SharePoint site.
I also just want to, it may be implied, but I just to be certain, it strikes me, given the focus of the response on some of the kind of economic modeling and on a lot of the kind of transportation modeling, I'd want to be sure that somebody from like the Agency of Commerce, like Ken Jones, or somebody from VTrans like Dan Dutcher had the chance to provide some feedback as well. I mean, I would first defer to those agencies on who makes the most sense and has the bandwidth. But given that those were those, maybe others as well, the carbon budget with relation to forestry. I mean, I know that ANR has a lot of the forestry experts in-house, but I wonder if there is. Anyway, it's just not necessarily suggesting that they would have to review all of them and be part of the review committee, but just wanting to make sure that those relevant agency staff also have the chance to provide some feedback before the RFP goes live, in addition to the subcommittee members.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And Jane, I think I'll reach out to you offline too, because I still don't know if I'm in conflict of interest given my multiple hats. And so from a climate change science perspective, bringing that to bear in terms of the questions, I want to have a conversation with perhaps you, Julie, and Matt again to make sure I walk that fine line, because those are critically important questions to also have in there as all of this is being framed. So even though Jay and I responded, to ask the question as to how best to sort of speak to a lot of this as we move forward.
That's great. Thank you, Leslie Ann. Okay, I think I have enough to go on for now to keep us moving forward with the technical contract services, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And then the question that is posed in terms of that process, is that in Monday's Climate Council meeting, is that something that you will ultimately pose, or is that something that this committee is posing to the full council to set the process there?
I will set that. I will speak to that.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so I just, we've done a pretty good job at hitting a lot of the things on the agenda, although we didn't have that robust discussion on the RFI. That will come next week in terms of the next meeting. I also just want to highlight that we haven't touched on the work plan yet. We're kind of doing the work plan. We're flying building the plane as we fly it. I messed up that metaphor, but you know what I mean. So I just want to highlight that, maybe we carve out some time for creating a process for a work plan, which I can think about and work on in the interim between this meeting and next. Any other comments from the subcommittee members or staff before we open it up for public comment?
I'm happy to follow up with about this with more detail when we check in, Jane, but just so we're all making sure we're all on the same page. One friendly suggested amendment to the timeline would be that April 1st day when there's a steering committee meeting is also a cross-sector mitigation meeting. So I imagine that there may be some folks on that committee who'd want to see the RFP as well before it goes live, since it's in service of their work. So maybe just a suggestion that we include them on the draft of the RFP, so they have the opportunity to provide feedback, on it, and perhaps devote some time on that agenda for any comments or feedback before it would go live on April 1st.
Great suggestion, and you may or may not have noticed that you and I are on the agenda tomorrow for cross-sector to sort of update on what this process is going to be. So that would be great.
Great.
Thanks. It might be worth inviting if anybody wants to join our committee meeting next week to talk about this from the cross-sector subcommittee.
Yeah, great idea.
Okay, any other comments from members?
Just a quick question. Was there a follow-up meeting, joint meeting scheduled that I didn't hear about today, or?
There was not.
Okay.
Okay, hearing no other members comment. Thank you, members of the public, for waiting patiently, and I want to just open it up for public comment. Okay, I see one hand raised, although I can't see your name. Mark.
Thanks, TJ. First, there are a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. First of all, the George Gross talked about a document last week. Jane, I think it was you that said it was posted. if you can point out where that's posted, that would be helpful. I can't find it. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was the relationship between something that Richard pointed out today and a comment that I made a couple of weeks ago. So a couple of weeks ago, I noted that the greenhouse gas inventory that we conduct doesn't account for much of the emissions that we Vermonters are responsible for. In particular, the emissions created by goods and services that we import from out of state. Ignoring these emissions could lead us to implement policies that damage the Vermont economy. I just noticed a headline where the governor of Colorado is suggesting that Coloradans refrain from eating meat one day a week. You know, the meat that we import into Vermont comes with a tremendous carbon price tag. So there are many other lifestyle choices that we could make that could reduce our actual emissions, the emissions that we are actually responsible for, rather than the emissions that we traditionally measure. And Richard's comment about the logic models and his example suggested to me how we might think about bringing about beneficial lifestyle choices as a part of this council work. But if we don't measure everything that we're responsible for, I think we're missing out on a lot of benefit that we could provide. And that's my comment.
Thank you for that, Mark, and tying a couple of those threads together from last week and this week. George Gross.
Good afternoon. Actually, Mark asked the question I was going to ask, which was among several questions. What was the current view about the document that we gave you about a week ago, as far as its posting in the public arena, and also when we could expect it makes it to the surface as an agenda item in your committee? The third question, with respect to life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, will the comprehensive energy plan be modeling with upstream emissions included?
So to your to your first question, I would need to rely on Jane to find out where that's modeled, and I think she may have had to leave, unfortunately, or where it's posted. We'll try and Jared, are you?
Sorry, I thought I was on TJ. Jane mentioned in the chat that the document would be posted at the end of by the end of the week.
Okay, great.
Another bunch that she's waiting to post all together.
Great, thank you. And in terms of it being an agenda item, we, as I mentioned, we're kind of trying to take things as we come, and we haven't developed a work plan yet. And I do think on that work plan, subject to the subcommittee's discussion, will need to be, maybe not subject, since it's on the it's part of the subcommittee charge to talk about revisiting our climate inventory and what is counted in that climate inventory and how it's structured. And I think at least I see that the materials you shared being considered in that context of what's the best way to what's the best way to account for our emissions. And I think that may go to Mark's point about the lifestyle choices and the products we consume as well. Your last question was the comprehensive energy plan modeling and embodied carbon. I don't think it is completely determined yet, although I think our starting point would be to use the current greenhouse gas inventory that is done by the state and that methodology, and subject to really the discussions that happen in this committee. I'm hopeful that those can happen on the front end of our work plan enough that they can really inform how the energy plan articulates the energy sector's emissions impact.
So to be clear, you would see using the same emission factors, for example, for fuel in both contexts of the climate action plan and also the comprehensive energy plan.
I would like that to be the case. I'm optimistic, but I need to see how both the processes play out to commit to that 100%. But yes, I think it would be really a challenge and confusing to have really different emissions factors for the same technology, for instance. I think that would really make policy making difficult, and I'd like to see them coordinated.
Sure enough. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate the comments and you hanging in with us for the whole meeting here. There any other? I don't see any other hands up, but are there any other public comments?
I'd just like to offer a follow-up to Mark's comment on the embedded carbon in our lifestyle. There has been some academic research in that, and I think I even cite to a couple of those as references in the white paper that you received from Gemini. It's on the order of 60% of our annual carbon footprint is embedded in the food and products and services that we purchase, not independent of the energy products that we might buy. So if you execute the plan focused strictly on the energy that is directly consumed by consumers, you're really only taking a 40% slice of the pie. So there is some merit to examining and figuring out how to tackle that other piece of the puzzle.
Thank you for that, George.
Thank you.
Okay, Leslie Ann, any final comments?
Yes, to thank everybody once again. I think we had a jam-packed session today that was really, really productive in helping to move a lot of the conversation and thinking forward. I very much look forward to continuing to get to know everybody on the subcommittee, all of our staffers, all of the members of the public who join us every week, like I like to say. Very much appreciate always seeing you, always hearing from you, and wish everybody a great rest of the week, and see you folks next week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Here.
Bye.